My name is John Barrick. I've been an accounting professor for 22 years, a certified public accountant for almost 30 years, and I spent 2 years working for the U.S. Congress at the Joint Committee on Taxation, evaluating tax proposals for both the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans. The Orem School District is the most important educational and financial decision in Orem in decades, maybe even ever. This is part 2 of my video outlining the Alpine School District calculations, the problems, errors, omissions, and the need for them to restate so that the truth can be made known. The Utah Taxpayers Association has called out Stronger Together for their claims of 56% tax increases, which are patently false. And those calculations are based on ASD's numbers. Jason Sundberg, a member of the business services team at Alpine School District, told me they were going to restate, and we're waiting for those numbers, Jason. Thank you. If you look at from the right-hand side, the second column from the right, correction for the 2017 WPU calculation mistake, it shows that unrestricted state revenues are $7.6 million higher because of the WPU mistake using 2017 numbers. And that adjusts or decreases the loss downward from $29 million to $21.5 million. And this is the revised Orem 2021 general fund estimate made by ASD with the file that was dated or named 9/6/2022, but it was actually dated in March of 2022, which means they knew about the mistake before they ever published the original $29 million loss. Why? Their employee can't explain. Examining Alpine School District's revised estimate from March 2022 that was dated in the file name September 6, 2022. Well, there's a number of things that don't tie. The $53.568 million of federal revenues doesn't tie to the audited financial statements. Remember, those were $50,304,442. In addition, the other local income doesn't tie either. It's $8,298,000 versus $10.361. Look at the expenses. Neither the Orem nor the Alpine numbers tie to the detail or to the audited financial statements in the case of Alpine School District. But nonetheless, notice that they show $105 million of direct school expenses in Orem schools and $28.8 million in expenses, which leads to the surplus or deficit, of $21.4 million, which is what they're claiming generates this 51% tax rate increase. All right, let's move to the next slide. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Alpine School District included the non-K through 12 fund, Fund 23. They combined this. They show $1.1 million of revenue income for ASD and $195,000 for the city of Orem, but this doesn't tie to the Fund 23 or non-K through 12 fund from the audited financial statements, which has $11.5 million of revenue and $11.5 million of expenses, and I'm not sure why, but they don't explain it either. This page comes from the financial statements, and it shows the non-K through 12 programs. It shows 11.571 million of revenues and 11.57 million of expenses. So I'm not sure why only a portion of that is being allocated to Alpine. You would expect that it would be the whole $11.5 million of revenue and the whole $11.5 million of expenses. I don't know why, and they don't explain it, but it's just not right. And that creates an issue of why that cannot be explained. In this step, on the second column from the right, we removed the Fund 23 or non-K through 12, non-major fund. It had $195,000 in Orem's revenue and about $2.4 million of direct and $329,000 of indirect or overhead costs, which actually overstates the Orem deficit by $2.5 million. Now, given that the federal amount, that the total amounts for ASD were revenues and expenses equal to each other at $11.5 million, I don't know how Orem can be running a $2.5 million deficit, nor do I know why both all the revenues and all the expenses weren't added in the ASD columns. Just doesn't make sense, and you can look at their calculations from their Google Drive to look at that. But I've removed these costs, and that leaves us with a starting point for a revised Orem general fund estimate without the Fund 23 complicating the matter, which is an $18.989 million deficit for the time being. Slide shows the Fund 10 expenditure by location fiscal year 2021, and it shows for all the Alpine School District schools. And on the far right city, you'll see the far right column, you'll see city, and on it will say Orem for all those schools that belong in Orem. For example, Aspen Elementary in row 107 shows expenses and expenses for Orem, both general expenses, direct expenses, and indirect expenses. And Aspen is in Orem, and it's listed as Orem. So is Bonneville and Cascade Elementary, so is Cherry Hill Elementary, so is Foothill Elementary, and they are all in Orem. Now, let's take the next part. Let's take a look at the next part of this slide, or this sheet, which is on the next slide. Slide highlights Geneva Elementary. You can see on the left, school 156, highlighted in green, Geneva Elementary. This school doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down in the fall of 2021 in November and consolidated with Parkside Elementary, which used to be Suncrest Elementary, into a single school, 2 Title I schools. The reason it was torn down was because it was old and seismically unsafe, and in February of 2022, the FEMA and the Utah Earthquake Group came out with a seismic study that identified Geneva as still very poor from the 2006 seismic study done by Revealing Engineering, and also was going to identify it on the 2022 study. And Alpine didn't want that heat, so they tore it down. The school doesn't exist anymore, but they're charging the full amount of expenses to Orem. Now, Alpine, another reason besides the seismic safeties, claimed that it was an unprofitable school and they needed to tear it down because they could have one principal instead of 2 principals at 2 smaller schools. And they could have less secretaries and less janitors and less heat, etc. And so there's probably a $500,000 savings, give or take a couple $100,000, but Alpine's unwilling to acknowledge that that's been torn down. Why? Why? Because it shows a larger loss for Orem schools that don't exist anymore? It just doesn't make sense. All right, let's go to the next school where things get more the next slide where things get more interesting with schools. Shows a number of other schools. One is Summit Online. Summit Online existed in Orem since 2007 or 18, and all of the expenses were charged to Orem, but Summit Direct wasn't ever an Orem school. It was an Alpine School District alternative high school. And notice the expenses per student are $30,000 per student, whereas the average is about $6,800 per student in Orem. So those students cost 5 times as much, but they charge all of the expenses to Orem. I'm not sure if Summit Online was ever in Orem. And having a conversation with a member of the Alpine School District Business Services staff, he agreed that that was probably not a good idea. Now, the next one is Polaris. Polaris is an alternative high school that was moved to American Fork, but all of the expenses were charged to Orem. Once again, the cost for these students, which was also a district school, were all charged to Orem, no proration. In reality, to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, we should remove all the Summit Online and the Geneva expenses and revenues for those schools, because they were all charged to Orem. Now, a member of the Alpine School District Business Services staff told me and a number of other people, including a teacher named Pat at Oak Canyon Junior High, that they were going to remove those costs and that they had a new $13 million loss for Orem, and they would be able to show that at some time, but he couldn't tell us when. Probably after the election, because they didn't want you to know that. Also, look at the Orem expenses. Orem expenses are $102 million, and the indirect support is $28 million. Neither of those numbers tie to the detail, and neither do the Alpine support or direct expenditures tie either. All right, let's move to our next slide. But Before we go, they are including $6 million of expenses for non-Orem students, non-Orem schools, Alpine School District schools, which they've moved and are no longer in Orem and Orem's expenditures. Let's be clear that that favors Alpine School District and makes the Orem loss look larger, even though they're not comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges.